Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I've been asked to talk about the flood risk management plans that have come through the CFRAM programme, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and how we're going to go about implementing these and the next steps. So just to start, for some of you who may not be familiar with the process, just to talk about where the plans came from. They came out of a major review of national flood policy that was undertaken in 2004. This led to the identification of the OPW as the lead agency for flood risk management in the country. That doesn't mean that we're responsible for doing everything, but we do coordinate then the various agencies and departments in terms of what they're doing in relation to flood risk management. They also importantly shifted us away from just reacting to events towards being proactive, looking at where may flood in the future and trying to prevent a flood perhaps from happening before it actually happens. And this was to be done on a catchment-based approach, so that initiated really the thinking around developing comprehensive flood maps around the country and the development of the flood risk management plans. Another very important element or recommendation that came out of the review, which was approved by government in September of 2004, is that we need to be looking at managing flood risk rather than solely trying to rely on flood protection. Flood protection clearly is a great outcome where we can achieve it. It stops the flood from happening up to a certain level in cities and towns around the country. But it is very expensive to implement. And there are other ways that we can reduce the damages if we're not actually providing flood protection itself. And that's around the area of flood prevention and preparedness and resilience. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. So following on from the review, which is really what led to the start of the CFRAM programme, the Floods Directive came in just as we were in the process of undertaking our pilot CFRAM studies. And this was very well aligned with the national policy at the time in terms of the need to undertake flood maps, the need to develop flood risk management plans based on a preliminary flood risk assessment, which was really a screening exercise to identify where the risk was significant and therefore where we should be focusing our efforts in terms of developing those maps and where we should be looking at measures that will go into the plans. The directive had a few other requirements. While from a floods perspective we will see water as a threat that we need to be protected against, equally the Water Framework Directive, which is another EU directive, sees water as a resource in terms of the water quality, the ecosystems, which needs to be protected from us. So they're quite opposing paradigms, but we need to coordinate with the Water Framework Directive side to make sure that we're identifying potential conflicts and managing those so that we're not doing something that will be necessarily damaging to the environment, or equally that something being done for the environment isn't going to be increasing flood risk. In Europe and also in the island of Ireland, rivers cross borders, so there needs to be transboundary cooperation. We've got a long-standing relationship with the Rivers Agency in the north, in terms of cooperation. And as with all environmental directives, there's a strong emphasis on public dissemination and engagement. And the directive set out that we need to be looking at this process on a 6-yearly cycle. So it's not just something that we do and then move on. We need to come back, repeat the process, review what we've done, and make improvements as we move forward. So in Ireland, just taking us through quickly the 3 steps, the preliminary flood risk assessment, which as I said is the national screening exercise really to identify where do we have a real problem. We took a 3-string approach to this here. We look back at evidence from the past, where's flooded in the past, where have there been significant damages arising from floods in the past. We look forward, we undertook some indicative national flood mapping and looked at, well, where are the towns, cities, communities that could be damaged by these floods if these floods were to happen in the future. And then very importantly, there was extensive consultation with the local authorities to try and make use of the local knowledge on flooding so that informed the whole process. And that was completed in 2011. We took it out to public consultation, and through that we identified the 300 areas for further assessment, or the AFAs as we call them here. And these are the communities at potentially significant flood risk. And we did focus on communities, and I'll come back to this later on, because these are the areas where the risk is concentrated, where there's a greatest chance that we'll actually be able to do something, justify doing investment to try and manage or reduce that risk. And as you can see, they're dotted well around the country. There's a very good spread. Yes, there is a concentration around Dublin, but that's perhaps only to be expected given the concentration of the population there. But there are many communities all around the country in rural areas as well as in the bigger cities that we've been looking at through the CFRAM. So the next step then is to develop the flood maps, and these are to undertake a more detailed assessment of getting a better understanding of, well, where is at risk, how do the floods propagate out across the floodplains, and to understand that we've developed a range of flood maps. These are flood extent maps showing the potential extent of flooding, flood depth maps showing us the potential depth of flooding for a given event, the overland flow velocity, the potential risk to people based on this, the flood zone maps, which are very important from a planning perspective, and a range of different flood risk maps as well. So just to give you an example, this is here in Athlone, the southern side of the town, as the river comes through and spreads out into the Callows. And these were the flood maps produced before the 2015-16 floods, but they corresponded very well actually to what was observed. And then the flood depth map for the, I think this is the 100 or 1,000 year flood event. What's the likely depth of flooding? And obviously that's very important in terms of looking at what damages might arise, but also for the emergency response if we know that a flood like this is coming down the line. So we produced a range of flood maps like that for up to 8 different flood event magnitudes, from very small frequent floods which perhaps don't cause very much damage to the really big extreme floods which are devastating. And following on from what Connor said this morning, we've looked not only at what we understand the flood risk to be now, but we've also looked forward to see, well, what could the potential impacts of climate change have for us? And this is very important because obviously investing in a flood relief scheme is a long-term investment. And we need to think, well, how is this going to cope with changes in flood risk moving into the future? So I produced a range of these maps, not only for the current scenario, but also for 2 potential future scenarios moving forward. So then we come to the plans. Looking at the information that the flood maps are telling us, we need to look at, well, what can we do to try and manage this risk? And that's going through a process of developing, costing, assessing and appraising a wide range of different potential options for managing the flood risk within a catchment, but also then for particular communities. And in Ireland, this has been done to quite a significant level of detail, probably more than most of the European countries, where we've brought this through to what we call line and level. So we have an understanding of, well, if we are to provide a flood protection for this community, where might it be, what kind of protection might it be, what level will it need to be to, and that's been subject to cost benefit and multi-criteria analysis. So what we've put forward in the plans is not a simple aspiration that we would like to develop flood protection for this community. It has been assessed, it's been costed, albeit at a strategic level, and more work does need to be done. But we have got some justification, some confidence in terms of moving forward with these measures, that they will be viable, that we will be able to put them into practice. Clearly, we need to do environmental assessments on these, and an SEA and an appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive has been undertaken, and there's been extensive public consultation already. That's not the end of the story. As we move forward on a project level, there will need to be obviously much more public consultation, but there has been a lot of public consultation already undertaken. So for example, on the options and the draft plans, we've held about 250 public consultation days around the country, where we've gone to the communities with the team, put up the flood maps, the options, the potentially preferred measure that we're looking at proposing, and discussing those with the communities. Do they fit into the community? Are they appropriate for the community? Is that what the community think is going to work? So following on from that, we've published then the draft plans around a year ago. They were put out to formal public consultation. We had a huge response to that, and that's taken quite a bit of time for us to go through. But we have now finalised all the plans from our perspective. They've been put over to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, Department of Finance as it is now, for them first to do an independent check on the environmental assessments, because the plans will require ministerial approval before they become final. For the Minister to be able to approve them, he needs to be able to say, yes, he's concluding on the environmental assessments. So DEPA have employed independent consultants just to check that the environmental appraisals are okay. But we're coming very close to the end of that process and would expect that the plans will be approved very soon. So what do the plans set out? They set out the measures that we are proposing to undertake to manage the flood risk. And they include well over 100 structural flood protection schemes. That's on top of the 20 schemes that we developed through the pilot CFRAM process, pilot CFRAM studies, which are already at various stages of planning, design and construction. Now this is a very, very significant investment. So we do need to prioritise these schemes. We simply don't have the capacity to implement well over 100 schemes and to start that process straight away. We need to prioritise them. Our budgets have increased up to 100 million a year, or will do in the next couple of years. But even given that, it simply won't be possible to start everything straight away. There will be a prioritisation required. And these schemes complement our existing and our past programmes. To date, we have implemented already about 40 flood relief schemes that provide protection to about 8,500 properties around the country, providing well over 1.5 billion euros of benefits in terms of reduced damages or losses avoided. There's a further 35 schemes also at various stages of construction, design and planning. So we have on top of that another well over 100 schemes coming down the line. So you can see that it's a very, very significant work programme. But as well as that, they're the major schemes that we'll be pushing through in conjunction with the local authorities. I just want to make sure that you're aware of what we call the minor works programme. This is where the OPW can put the local authorities in funds to implement local solutions for local problems. Building a major scheme is quite a significant undertaking. There are problems around the country that can be dealt with lesser interventions. And this is what the minor works programme was implemented to address. And to date, the OPW has approved well over 30 million euros of investment to the local authorities for over 650 projects. So if there is an issue that's not perhaps addressed within the CFRAM, that's not to say the OPW won't assist in addressing that, but we can do so through the minor works programme. And these structural flood relief schemes, either that are in hand, that have been built already, or that are being proposed, will provide protection for all but a very small percentage of the properties at risk in these 300 communities around the country. So I think when we've achieved this, as we roll this out, we will be providing a very good level of protection for many people around the country. But these schemes, they can be quite significant investments, and they're not viable or they're not suitable for every location. So we need to be thinking, again, coming back to the policy review, in terms of not relying solely on flood protection, but also on non-structural measures that can reduce the risk or the damages to people, even if we cannot be preventing the flooding in those locations. So there's a range of prevention and protection measures, or preparedness measures, which are also generally in hand, but are emphasised through the flood risk management plans. So, for example, the National Flood Forecasting Service. This was something that was identified through the 2004 policy review as something that needs to be looked into, to be investigated. It has been, and it's been a government decision was made early last year to move that forward. So work is in hand, developing a National Flood Forecasting Service, which I think is absolutely critical. The emergency response capacity of the local authorities and the principal response agencies, I think, has improved enormously over the last few years. I think if we look at the response to the events of November 2009, when there were a huge number of properties around the country that were flooded, and then compare that to what happened in 2015-16, which in many parts of the country was an even worse flood than 2009, and yet far fewer properties actually flooded. And that was down to, obviously, the huge efforts of the local community themselves, but also the emergency response authorities in terms of their having learned from past events and really knowing what to do. But again, there's always room for improvement. The flood maps that we've developed will help greatly inform the development of emergency response plans. So that's an area where we will continue to work with the various authorities. Individual and community resilience, I think, is really at the heart of what's being discussed here today. This is where the community can take action to help themselves. The states will obviously be coming forward with the flood relief schemes and so on. But there's a huge amount that individuals and the community can do to manage the risk themselves. And I think that this afternoon we'll hear more about that. Individual property protection, some of you may be aware of. These will be the floodgates, for example, that you can put across doorways, prevent water that may be in your property, around your garden, perhaps getting into the properties themselves. And a very good example of this would have been Cork City Centre in early 2015 or 2014, when the surge forecast was given to the City Council, so the city knew that the flood was coming from the sea. They advised the property owners, the businesses in the city centre, and those who had floodgates were able to implement those and effectively prevent the flooding that was on the streets from getting into their property. So once the flood had gone, the gates came out, there was a bit of clean up to do, but they were back in business very quickly. So there's a huge amount, again, that individuals, the communities, the businesses can do to protect themselves, and the individual property protection is a key way of delivering that. And finally, another area which is coming under, I suppose, increasing emphasis is what we call natural flood risk management. This is where we work with the natural processes, particularly through agricultural practice, in terms of trying to prevent so much water running off so quickly, which is then causing flood risk downstream. And we're engaging with the EPA and the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government to look at how, with the Water Framework Directive, we can be enhancing this kind of approach. I think finally, that I haven't mentioned on here, is the whole prevention area. This is around sustainable planning. There was a huge amount of criticism after the November 2009 floods that a lot of the properties that did flood were new properties. Maybe they're properties that have been built in the wrong place. So there are guidelines there for planners to take into account in terms of zoning, in terms of looking at, well, where can we be building our new properties, because obviously there is a significant demand for new housing. But let's make sure that that housing is in a suitable area. There's no point building new houses in flood risk areas. They're just building up problems for the future. So there's a whole range of measures I've gone through there where we can reduce risk for those properties either not benefiting from protection within the AFAs, but also that can benefit the properties outside those AFAs. So these are measures which can be applied all around the country. So just looking forward quickly, time's against us, into the second cycle of the Floods Directive. Obviously in the first cycle, the key vehicle for implementing the directive was the CFRAM programme. And this has been a very ambitious, a very comprehensive and inclusive programme in terms of looking to see what we can do in a huge number of communities around the country. We did find, as we went through the more detailed assessment, that quite a few of the 300 areas that we identified were actually at a relatively low level of community risk. There may be a small number of properties at risk, but there wasn't significant risk there to justify a flood relief scheme. But because we've taken such a comprehensive approach, I suppose, in the first cycle, there's limited value in repeating exactly the same process. We've really covered off the areas where the risk is most significant in the first cycle. So there won't be a CFRAM 2, but clearly there is still a lot of work that we do need to keep doing to improve the flood risk management process in Ireland. A huge amount of our activity going forward will be to implement the flood relief schemes that we've identified. As I said, we have 35 already in hand, there's 40 completed, and we have well over 100 new schemes that we now need to put in practice. So that in itself is a huge amount of work that will be occupying us over the coming years. The Minor Works programme started in 2009. As I said, over 650 projects have had funding approved for that, and that is ongoing. So that will be further areas for development in the coming years. And as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, our focus in the first cycle was on communities at potentially significant risk. But we do recognise and fully understand that there are obviously properties and areas in more rural areas where there is nonetheless risk. So what we're looking to do, or what we're looking to do, is to get a better understanding of that rural risk as we move forward. Equally, the potential impacts of climate change, we have for the 300 areas identified what the potential increase in flood risk might be due to climate change. And again, we need to extend that out now to areas that weren't covered in the 300 AFAs. Things change on the ground. For example, embankments might be built, new roadways. So there will be a programme of ongoing review and update of the flood maps to make sure their understanding of risk is up to date and is current, and that will be an ongoing programme of work. Similarly, critical infrastructure. We're focused on properties for the moment. Sorry. This is the last slide, so I'll be almost finished. Critical infrastructure. If a waterworks or a water treatment plant is flooded, obviously there's damages to that plant, but it has knock-on or domino effects elsewhere. So what we want to do is to work with the utilities in getting a better understanding of the potential impacts of flooding of our critical infrastructure, and then what they might do to try and make sure that there is resilience in the systems. And of course, there's more work we can be doing to further develop the non-structural measures, such as a scheme potentially for individual property protection. So that's it. Thank you very much.